Good evening. Hi, welcome to the ICA. I'm Rosalie Dobell, the Associate Curator of Talks. I am delighted to welcome you to our ICA Quickfire event, Censoring Social Media. Thanks for all coming on this kind of warm evening, and thank you to our speakers, Charlie Woolley, Paola Tubaro and Ali Kazma. Before I introduce our chair this evening, who will then in turn introduce the speakers, I wanted to acknowledge Ukrainian artist Nikita Kadan, who we'd hoped would be able to make it this evening, unfortunately can't. Nikita's artwork has been, sorry, can I just put this on? The image that has been promoting tonight's event. Nikita's art practice includes collaborations with architects, activists and social scientists. He's been a member of the art group RAP, which is the Revolutionary Experimental Space since 2004, which attempts to use art to draw public attention to issues such as violations of human rights in Ukraine. As he couldn't be with us, Nikita has kindly prepared a video presentation detailing his experience with the Maiden Square protests. And this link to this can be found on the event page on the ICA website. So I'd urge you to go away and take a look at that later on this evening, and we're very grateful to him. Now to our chair, Mark Stephens, a solicitor specialising in media law, intellectual property rights and human rights. Mark has undertaken high-profile cases in the UK and abroad. He's extraordinarily active in other areas too, and Mark chairs a number of bodies, including the Contemporary Art Society and the University of East London. Mark is a trustee of Index of Censorship and the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation. We're hugely grateful for him taking the time to join us this evening, and I shall pass over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalie. And thank you all for coming to the ICA on what is a very warm night here. I think some of you are very smart to have worn shorts. I was a bit concerned about wearing shorts myself in case you could see up the side. We're using the hashtag ICA Quickfire tonight, so if you want to tweet while we're going on. People are watching us remotely, so it would be good to have your interactions with them. Now, we all believe in censorship. We all believe that there are some things that are best not said. Now, that could be for social reasons. It might be that if I say, does my bum look big in this? You will laugh and titter and say, no, of course it doesn't. And that's a kind of social censorship that we have. We also say things because, for example, we might think that in times of conflict, which is also something we want to talk about tonight, that loose lips lose lives. So there are all sorts of things that we're sensitive about. And we see censorship around different things. For example, the backlash of the state in relation to religion, where states are uncomfortable with diversity and discussion of religion. Public morality, even old colonial insult laws, something I come across in my job all the time, where we as a colonial power, a minority power, propped up our regimes by having rules that said you couldn't insult a district officer, being the lowest white person in the colonial regime. Those laws have been maintained with some alacrity post-independence, interestingly, and so we see those kind of laws continuing into the future. And we keep bumping up against free speech on the internet, particularly at times of political unrest. And we've got with us tonight a completely wonderful international panel from the East. We've got the wonderful Turkish artist Ali Kazma. From the West, we've got London-based artist Charlie Woolley, him with a beard, and from right in the meridian, right in the middle of herself, we've got Dr. Paola Tubaro from the University of Greenwich. And I'm going to ask Paola to start and begin by looking at the areas that you've been looking at, which I think involve something to do with whether you've been looking at whether censorship produces more violence, which is, as I said to you earlier, I was really interesting because I was looking at whether language was an indicia to conflict in my research. So let's have a bit from you.
Okay, so thanks very much. So I'm Paola Tubaro, and I'm a social scientist. I used computer simulation to study this particular question. I was motivated to do this study by the August 2011 riots in the UK, which, if you want, were sort of an enigma for everybody. It seemed just, to many at least, an outburst of violence that it was difficult to understand, at least at the beginning, and many, even very senior policymakers, focused very much on the need to urgently reestablish peace in the streets, some went as far as to say that we don't need your usual social scientist explanations, your unemployment, poverty, whatever, this is sheer criminality, which of course I didn't like. But what mattered here for me was that it appeared that this use of social media, broadly speaking, BBM, Facebook, Twitter, was possibly fueling the riots, and the possibility of censorship was considered, even though not ultimately not adopted. So with my co-author, we asked a very simple question. Let's leave aside all the issues of whether censorship would be legal, ethical, technically possible, and let's just ask, if the goal is, as they say, to stop violence, will censorship work? So how do you go about that? Well, we use computer simulation informed by our observation of debates, especially online debates those days. And computer simulation, you can think about it as a sort of more sophisticated video game, and the basic ingredients of a video game are the characters and a space where you put them and you let them interact. So who are our characters? Well, citizens, the people of Britain, who might have their own appreciation of the government and its policies. Some of them might be happy with them, some less. Some might be more affected by the cuts, for example. And so they have a different degree of grievance, I would say, toward the government. And grievance, we know, might prompt some of them to go active, which in the abstract might mean rioting, protesting, doing something. Now, of course, you don't just go in the street and protest because you are unhappy with the government. There need to be the relevant, appropriate circumstances. You are much more likely to join an existing protest that is already there than to start one on your own. And you certainly won't go there all alone. So, your choice of whether to go active or not will depend on what you think about the government, its policies, but also on what others around you are doing. And then, of course, there are the authorities out there, the police, and some of the active people, if things go bad, might be caught. Now, what we did was to create, as I said, we need a space to put our characters, so we create a sort of virtual city on the computer, a simulation of London, and we put all our little characters, little citizens and policemen there. I don't know if it's visible enough, but the slides will be online. And then you let them interact, you let them choose to go active or not, you let them move around. For example, it might be that active people will want to join clusters of other active people, and so move around space. Some will get arrested. And so you see patterns emerging at the level of the city as a whole that changes its shape as people are changing their behaviors. And you can follow the behavior of one single one of them, from single citizen to active to perhaps jailed. But what matters is not much the individual stories, but the global patterns that emerge at the city level by the interactions of so many people, even with so simple rules, after all, that create very complex patterns that are observable at a higher, I would say, macro city level. Now, how do we think about social media and all that? Well, social media are like, in our view, expanding the vision of individuals. Think about the single active citizen who normally, what would they see? They would see the corner in which they operate, what is just around them. But with social media, they're able to look farther away to see what's happening, maybe in another neighborhood or in another town. And they can make more informed decisions based on the extra information that they gain through Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is. And of course, what does then censorship mean? That would mean taking out this vision, this power of scanning the environment from citizens. So bringing them back to the low level of vision, my narrow corner that would characterize a society where there would be no social media. Now, what happens when there is censorship relative to when there is no censorship at all? Well, we observed after many simulations runs with these different conditions that when you have total censorship, so no vision at all except one's own corner, what you observe over time is a pattern in which the number of active citizens, rioters, goes up very quickly at the beginning and stays there all the time, never goes down. Many people rioting always. When you have partial censorship, so imagine some kind of restriction to access to the internet that could restrain vision, but not totally, the pattern is broadly similar, but however, the average number of rioters is half as much, is much lower, so less violence overall. And when you remove censorship, so everyone can see everything through social media, you see a completely different pattern. The average number of rioters is lower, goes down again by half, but it's not only that, it's not always peace, because you do have peaks of violence, and they can be very high at times. However, between these peaks of violence, there are periods of peace. That is, periods in which nobody is rioting and all the citizens are returning to quiet. So why is that? Well, the reason is that through social media, with expanded vision, people can see a lot of different examples, not just other rioters that they might be incited to follow in acts that might be violent or somehow bad, but also different examples, including, if we think about the case of the UK riots, the more constructive experience of like the clean-up movement that was put in place during the riots and attracted a lot of participants precisely by advertising its initiatives through Twitter in particular and social media. So with vision, people are better informed and can access a wider variety of messages that inform their behaviors much better than when they aren't informed at all. And that's what makes the difference that we observe. So if I can conclude, and I hope I'm still in the 10 minutes allocated to me, the main message from this research, which by the way is published, and I can give you references if you are interested, the main message is that if we are accepting censorship as and trading of our civil freedoms in exchange of some sense of security, well, that might backfire, that might be illusory. Thanks very much.
That's absolutely fabulous, Paola, and I really hope that, yes, do. I think that's right. Give a round of applause. Spectacular. I do hope we can come back to this, because I think this theme of looking at censorship through the lens or excuse of security is very, very interesting, particularly as David Cameron and our political leaders on a bipartisan basis are desperately trying to get drip onto the statute books. It was in the House of Lords this afternoon. With that, I'd like to move on to Charlie Woolley, who's at Charlie Woolley, if you happen to be tweeting. Charlie explores the aesthetics of protest and the representation of social uprisings. Now, what's your take on this, Charlie?
Okay, well, I was going to introduce my practice via a particular exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be really helpful. We asked you to look at, we have our own concept of time and motion, which you showed at Auto Italia Southeast first, in the Old Kent Road, didn't you?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so tell us a bit about that.
So, we have our own concept of time and motion was a title lifted from the archivist in me is racking my brains, the 3rd or 4th issue of Class War, a newspaper that was very prevalent in the protest movement in Britain in the late 70s and early 80s. And we should have known we were in for trouble from the very beginning, because we fudged the title. The original was we have our own concept, we have our own idea of time and motion. And because we used the word concept by mistake, we instantly had a backlash, because we were artists, that we were being pretentious, because somehow concepts are loftier than ideas. So, but obviously the time and motion relates to time and motion studies, post-Fordism, and autonomism. And this was taking place in 2011 when those ideas were very rife. So we used this VW car showroom that we'd taken over as Auto Italia to put on a weekend of events, and I did so as an artist myself in collaboration with the now defunct ultra leftist propaganda machine, the Deterritorial Support Group, the artist Richard John Jones, and the writer and at the time pop-up bookshop owner Federico Campagna. What we had proposed was really an events weekend to look at Italian autonomism, its history and how it would relate to artists and self-organization at that point. And so I'll just skip over, and I just wanted to show a couple of posters that were produced by the Deterritorial Support Group at that time that had become a very hot topic among the student protests and the and also on into the riots.
Is it worth just because I think we've got some foreign people in the audience, it might be just explaining the Territorial Support Group?
Well, the Territorial Support Group was a police initiative in order to respond to activism, basically. Is to, these vans full of coppers who could turn up at any minute and jump out and knock you about, basically. The deterritorialization is a sort of Deleuzian concept, so the mixture of the two, although, this, I can't speak for them, so why they came up with that name is nothing to do with me. But they, anyway, they were sort of largely talked about that time, and they had rejected the kind of the propaganda, the leftist propaganda that had been being used, relying on historical tropes, and decided to come up with something a bit newer, and it really worked a treat, and they'd also been involved in several sort of almost pranks. There was a rumor of Slavoj Žižek getting together with Lady Gaga for an event in London. There was also well, anyway, the Territorial Support Group, I recommend looking up and sort of looking into that history, because it was quite important at the time. This was, I think, my favourite. So we built this space in the car showroom for people to inhabit, to utilise, and to be around all day for workshops and talks. And the furniture which you're looking at now, it was my effort for the exhibition. The reason why I talk about it, because I think it was something kind of interesting happened. We decided on this kind of very soft aesthetic. The building we were inhabiting was a newly refurbished car showroom that had gone bust, and we were using this building. So it was an extremely immaculate and slick building. And in it, we built this kind of almost sort of dot-com era office area made with beanbags and sort of hippie furniture. And we turned the place into kind of a site of production. There was a risograph machine, there was workshops constantly, there was lots and lots of people in and out. We were producing furniture at quite a high rate. And all the wood that we used for the exhibition had been reclaimed from the riots, from boarding up buildings. So we'd sort of reclaimed all this wood and turned all this like a transitional material. This is the event. It's some of the events itself. Gustav Metzger turned up and asked some questions. I love that photograph of Metzger. He looks like he's sort of surrounded by disciples. Biffo Berardi, another speaker, Federica Campagna, Nina Power, Ian Bone, Class War, doing a tour with me and the artist Hugh Lemmy of a load of radical paraphernalia that we'd sort of put forward on display. Nina Wakeford, Marina Vishmit, Mark Fisher, and so on. So that gives you a sort of idea of it. The reason why I think it was sort of interesting for this context is because when we were putting the show together, we really hadn't kind of thought of the instant response we would get from people who were involved in the same subject matter. And a couple of days before we opened, at Danny Anarchy on Twitter had written to us. He'd been sort of trolling us for quite a while, and he wrote that the exhibition looked like an anarchist IKEA, which ended up being the sort of heart of the exhibition. And we would tweet back at him, "We have our own IKEA of time and motion," and I think it showed something that was in the air, that we had taken a kind of aesthetic that was sort of hippie-ish and almost corporate, a space that was very slick and polished, and filled it full of ideas around self-organisation and autonomism. And people were very unhappy about that. We had threats that the building would be burnt down. We were accused of gentrifying Peckham, and we generally had quite an angry response from the ultra-left. They believed that what we were doing was sort of somehow taking a subject that they felt to be theirs and wrapping it up in the language of art and an aesthetic they didn't trust. And I think the veracity of aesthetics among the left is quite a complicated notion. And because we didn't just sort of kick a door in and write "occupied" on the wall, somehow we weren't going about it the right way. So this exhibition was really pivotal for me, and a lot of the work I've produced since has been around this kind of idea of the left and the veracity of left-wing aesthetics, and how they often sort of let people down, actually. And I think we've seen quite a lot of that definitely emerging from 2011 and subsequent protest movements afterwards. How am I doing for time? A little bit more. So I'll just run through the following exhibition. I did almanac projects called Postscript P.S. I Love You, which was an exhibition about 2011 in 2013, looking at the possibility of how we were going to then process and remember the sort of tumultuous events we'd been through and been a part of, and how they'd marked our lives. The subject of memorial and monument has always been very key to my practice, and I think it unfair that monuments and memorials are only made for old, rich, white men. So I was in the process of producing a series of sort of temporary memorials to be proposed to remember protests, and so this was the sort of core of this exhibition. And here are some of the sort of propositions for memorials. So I'm just going to quickly scoot through these. So there we are. Okay, sorry, I've done something bad.
Don't worry.
Okay. So that gives a sort of introduction to who I am. There you are.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thanks, Charlie. Maybe a round of applause for Charlie as well. I just love this idea of an anarchistic IKEA. Also, that debate between traditional left and artistic left, and whether they can cope with that. And maybe we can talk a bit about that, because one of the other things that I'm very interested in is whether, and I hope you will be, and one of the things we're going to do here, folks, is that we're going to have a conversation here when Ali has spoken, and we're then going to open up a conversation here, and then we're going to take it out to you as well. So everybody's included in this debate. No censorship here tonight. But one of the things I'm interested in, and maybe you could think about, is whether you know, the social media and the internet is actually the legitimate inheritor of John Wilkes and his sort of radical writings in the 18th century, or perhaps the penny dreadfuls that were sold in St. Paul's churchyard, or perhaps even pirate radio station at another level. It seems to me that, you know, every generation brings through these kind of challenges, which I think, you know, maybe we could talk a bit about. I'd like to now turn to Ali Kazma, who's at Ali Kazma 4, in case you're tweeting. And we're still using the hashtag ICA Quickfire. Ali is best known for his video works, which raise questions about the significance of social organizations. You may well have seen his work at the 55th Venice Biennale, or perhaps at the 2011 Biennale, although he's been in 3 biennales in Istanbul and elsewhere. So, Ali, you're going to show us some images. Are you plugged in now?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So, do you want to just take this away?
Well, I think I can safely say here, or maybe not, that I come from the only country where Twitter was blocked among us, and also YouTube was blocked. This happened last year. During the elections, there were some recordings of the ministers and the prime minister corruption talking about really strange stuff. I'm not going to get into that, but the government was very much worried about that, and they blocked it. And it was anti-constitutional, the blockage, and since then the higher courts declared it to be so, and now it's back on. But they knew that, and they blocked it. But we can talk about the details of that later if we want. But before the blocking, I just want to say that technically it's kind of difficult to block these things. I was not on Twitter, but the day Twitter was blocked, I got in from Turkey, because it was kind of like you just downloaded Google Chrome and you put ZenMate, and you can just go into Twitter or anywhere you want. So technically, it's a bit difficult to do. But what I want to start my talk with is, why did the government have this need to block it? And what are the circumstances under which the government felt that it needed to control the social media? And I'm going to start by something that happened a few months ago in Turkey. Maybe some of you have heard about it, but we lost about 300 mine workers in a so-called accident in Turkey. These kinds of accidents don't happen anymore in Europe or in other countries, but they used to happen, I guess, in the 19th century here, but somehow in Turkey it still happens. And the day it happened, I decided to go to the location where it happened, because I didn't want to follow it through the social media or the mainstream media, which is very biased in Turkey, as it is here, I guess, but maybe more so. So I went there myself, and I took some images. I didn't want to take images of, I didn't want to, yeah, you'll see the images I take. Here is a 2-minute video I did, some of my observations at that time. The bodies just kept coming from. That was the area where they were digging up the bodies.
Evet, sabahtan bu yana Soma önemli isimleri ağırladı. Başbakan Erdoğan gelmişti. Bir de yine Cumhurbaşkanlıklar adaydı.
Why I think it's important is I just want to talk a little bit about the economic relationships between the media, mining, construction, banking. The same company that's running this mine that has so much, that has not invested at all in security and safety of the workers, is also building this big high-rise in Istanbul. Each flat is now sold for about $1 million or $2 million, I don't know the price, but they're building this, and this is the link to the government in this case is to be able to get a permit for that, you need connections, and you need to be able to bend the rules. And to get the rights to mine, you also need government connections. So the company which does that also does that, and similar companies also run the media groups in Turkey. So all of it is kind of together. All of it runs together. So this is one thing I would like to bring into attention. And here is another thing I witnessed personally. It is one second, sorry. This is the Gezi protests that happened last year, and it happened very much near where I live. And this also happened, well, not just for one reason, but the spark was the government wanted to build a shopping mall in one of the only parks remaining in the city center. Think about them trying to build a mall somewhere here and take down all the trees. And that was how it started. And again, it's one of those companies that have a lot of connections to the government. Probably they have a stake in one of the media groups. So it's all kind of together. It's a nice, and you can see one of their, actually, this is one of the news cars that tried to make a broadcast from the area, and it was taken over by the people and just written many things. Like one of it is in what happened. Can we get, maybe not.
Should we just start talking, well, we'll see if we can fix that.
Well, it was during this time that the media, the mainstream media, was very much it was the time that we understood that we could not rely on them, basically. When this was happening, the riots were happening, they were showing documentaries of penguins in the Arctic. This is the kind of stuff they were showing. So this is when the social media became quite important. In my personal story, this is when I started to really get onto the Facebook and try to follow up what was going on, and through my other friends get on the Twitter and see what was happening. And this became the only reliable source for us for a long time, because all these media, the mainstream media, were afraid of the anger of the prime minister, and they just could not become objective. They just could not report anything that made the government look bad. So for us it was really important. Before all these events, I always thought of social media as kind of fickle and not so, I didn't feel it deserved a lot of my attention. Still, I have a lot of doubts about it, but at this time it became for us quite crucial to organize ourselves, to let people know. Even when you were running from the police, people were tweeting where the police was coming from and all that. So it became for us quite important at this moment. And it also leaked a lot of images that would otherwise not be shown. And it also angered people a lot, enough that they would become active citizens rather than stay in their homes and do nothing. So for us it was at this time quite important. I'm going to cut it for now. Well, there we go.
So I think we lost the projector, not your computer.
Yeah, maybe. Good. Well, as you can see, there was maybe a British activist as well, writing something with an F word there. That's, yeah. So there was a lot of graffiti and lots of... So this is another thing I wanted to show you is, when you see images of these things on the mainstream, you always kind of see the violence and the most dramatic images. But this I wanted to show because this is one of the, again, the news networks minibuses that got just kind of taken out of them because of the anger people felt towards the mainstream media. They just couldn't survive in that area anymore. But in general, it was kind of quite peaceful, with a lot of different people from different types of organizations doing their own tents, talking to one another. But then there was also moments of violence.
I think we've lost the projector again.
No, it's okay. It's not that...
Sorry?
Okay.
Oh, just lost the lamp. Okay, look, I was really interested, and I'm sure we all were. Let's all just pick up the mics and hit in now. But it did seem to me really interesting that this cross-media ownership issue, which, you know, to some extent we have here with Murdoch owning Sky News and Sky Television and The Times and The Sun and everything else, as well as some movie channels. That is a real issue. Now, you said, well, I became interested, and your provocation was you can't trust the media because they're not actually fulfilling the watchdog role. They're not challenging the executive in the way that we would normally expect. So
quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah, they sort of support...
They're supporting him.
Because they presumably want to get the advertising from the government that supports them.
They want to get the contracts. They want to build nuclear plants. They want to build roads. They want to get the nice mines. They want to dig gold. There's many different reasons.
But how does that play when you come to social media and you come to the internet? Because in most countries, I mean, I think this is sort of almost... one of the bull points in this debate about censorship, because censorship is almost now being privatized, because the people who are the gatekeepers to information, I mean, they, you know, utter words about democratization of knowledge, access to information, but in actually, they are the new censors. They are the people. How's that playing out in Turkey, and how do you guys think that? So, Ali first, and then we'll move along.
Well, self-censorship is the rule of the day in Turkey, because the boss at top is in business with, and the owners of all the whole media is maybe 5 big groups. All of them know the prime minister and the government by name, and They are in business, they're doing business together, they are on the same team. So it is very naive to imagine that they allow something bad about the government to be said on the media. And we see it now. Everybody who had a kind of a stance as a journalist, in the sense that we know them to be, like trying to understand the truth or what was happening behind doors, kind of this kind of journalists, they've all been kicked out. There's only now people who carry the tag of a journalist, but they just print what the bosses want and what the government wants. And not only do we see this or suspect it, but we've heard it. We've heard the ministers talking to media bosses that were leaked, these tapes that were leaked onto the internet. We heard them warning them about, not even hinting it, but saying, why is this person still writing in your newspaper? This kind of things.
To the futility of censorship at some level, or are the internet service providers in Turkey censoring too?
No, because this is the interesting thing. Maybe Paola can talk about it, but it is very difficult to censor. They try. The Turkish government tries to negotiate with Twitter, with Facebook, with YouTube. They want to be able to censor it, but it's proving to be not so easy, I guess. Maybe you can help us with these technicalities as well.
Yeah, I would add to your considerations another perspective, perhaps, of the enormous power, however, that Twitter, Facebook, and the big social media companies might come to have, because on the one hand, we advocate, and I advocate against censorship, but I don't advocate against regulation. Facebook, Twitter, and all those that came before them have censored contents here and there for different reasons that in some cases might seem also, I mean, quite reasonable. But where do we put the barrier, you know? Where should they stop? I mean, they might stop some contents that are offensive, for example, or that are thought to be, I mean, against the law or something, but where should they stop? It's a very difficult question, and sometimes these companies are left alone making decisions, all the more so as they make their decision at global level, where they cannot easily be countered by any government with its own views and policies, whatever they are. And so there is a danger of censorship from there too, if it goes too far.
But is that a localized danger of censorship, in the sense that if I'm with an American internet service provider, they're going to be working because the American society requires it to sort of First Amendment type standards, and but if I'm with a Thailand internet service provider, certainly they're not going to want to be saying anything that's particularly controversial. So does it then become a matter of where you are on planet Earth as to what information you can impart and receive, do you think?
Oh, yeah, in part that has been the case so far, and indeed we have seen some like censored content not being entirely eliminated, but just traveling to another country where they weren't repressed in any way. And I'm thinking one other research I'm doing is on pro-anorexia websites that are often considered harmful or potentially harmful for viewers for health reasons. And they were banned by as far back as AOL in 2001, but what they did is they spread from the United States to Europe and from English to other languages. Now, so will that be the case in future, and what are the dangers of that, of perhaps fragmentation of the internet, which is not a good thing either. So it's, you know, it's a tricky area here.
Charlie, do you see a problem with censorship coming from the internet service providers and people like Facebook? I mean, one of the things that was troubling me, I was on a Swedish museum site recently and noticed that their Facebook page, which had a Mapplethorpe on it, had put a Facebook logo over what were considered by Facebook to be the rude parts of a lady. Basically her front bottom and her front bosoms. But, you know, how do you react to all of this?
Well, I think some of what's being said is very interesting, especially around the notion of the corporations that are these platforms for so-called free speech. As the corporations are gaining the rights of individuals in themselves over the last few years, the discussion of corporations as individuals is quite dominant. I was talking earlier about the voice that these social media platforms allow you, and while actually in your writing that's very interesting, you talked about the sort of strange dichotomy between the liberation, or the West saying that Twitter has liberated these places, these poor places that don't have democracy, yet they say it's the apparatus for causing riots and protests in the, back home. So it's a very interesting point. And so, this idea that Twitter gives you some sort of freedom, and actually the sort of, the greatest freedom you have is to troll, actually, is to go onto those sites and speak angrily or speak sarcastically or with a sort of snarky nature. I mean, that's kind of the freedom that's allowed people, is to actually, that's a kind of way of, fitting in between. You've got this platform that is ultimately a corporation who own what you're saying, who can take it away from you whenever they want. So all you can do really is be kind of angry. It doesn't allow for much more productive speech than that in a lot of ways.
I mean, Ali, you spoke about the futility, but you also spoke about self-censorship, and I was struck by that particularly because there was a case just recently of Shahira Amin, who's an Egyptian who lives in Turkey, who'd been writing about Erdogan, and as a result of what she wrote, she suddenly got really badly trolled, and she got death threats. And effectively, at the end of it, she put up a post and said, look, this is what's been happening to me since I've been writing about this topic. It's too dangerous for me. I'm giving up. I'm self-censoring. I'm not going to speak anymore. Is that a common experience? I mean, how is self-censoring working in Turkey at the moment?
Well, I guess you're not someone if you haven't got some death threats in Turkey for something you wrote.
Clearly I'm nobody.
If you write on these hot topics, there are actually trolls on. I'm not very technically, I don't know how it's done. I'm not, I was not so interested in these things.
No, we're
before.
more interested in the policy, I think.
But there are people paid by certain interest groups to really intimidate you and to make you feel a bit lonely, or to make you feel you're going against barking at the wrong tree or something like that. So this happens. All the spaces are up for grabs in this new economy in Turkey, and the social media is again up for grabs. So if you can pay enough people to spread your views or to attack those who are writing against you, it is done. We know it is done. It's not something, I have never heard of a threat being carried out, and a lot of the writings on social media seems to be a little bit too easily saying threats like that. I mean, also, and I read some of the stuff that are being written here, it gets into this strange threatening mood quite easily, things on the net. I haven't heard of anything being carried out, but there is this intimidation factor going on. But the self-censorship I was talking about was mostly in the mainstream media. You know that they won't print some of the things you write. This was what I was talking about more. But in the example you've given and in some others, there are people who have stopped because they were intimidated. This is for sure.
Is this something any of you two have come across? Or?
I think it's interesting the idea of the battle for the internet as a free space, because it was early on imagined as a sort of autonomous zone for weirdos, and it was still kind of a weird and wild place. And slowly we've seen the gentrification of the internet and the taking over by corporations. But there were so many marginal voices that are now censored in a way. And it occurs to me that censorship there's also been a kind of activism around a type of censorship as well, with groups like Anonymous pursuing fringe political groups, so especially right-wing organisations. And by using the technology, they've managed to take down one by one all the largest right-wing communities online. I think Stormfront is the only one left standing because they have some sort of vague technical knowledge. But it's interesting how this is, as you say, a kind of battle for supremacy, whether the corporations will take the voice of the internet or whether it can belong to sort of people. But I think that's really interesting that it sort of flows in all directions.
Yes. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about here is that there seems to me to be attacks on a variety of levels in this. I mean, if we accept this proposition, which I think we should, about there being a war in the free speech space, and let's not forget that free speech includes the right to receive information as well as to impart it. But in that space, it seems to me that there's this kind of intimidation level, which is, and I was very struck. I was in Azerbaijan recently, where they make a great play. I mean, they're currently chair of the Council of Europe, the guarantors of the European Convention on Human Rights on free speech. And they say, we don't have any laws against free speech, but if you say something against the Prime Minister or the President, you're in real trouble. And there's one woman who they had the security services put a video recorder in her bedroom and had her recorded making love to her boyfriend, which, in a fairly orthodox Muslim country is a pretty difficult thing to do. And they sent her the DVD and said, if you carry on writing, we're going to release this. She carried on writing. They released bits of it. And so it went on. They played this game of chicken. And eventually she just released the whole thing on YouTube and said, OK, now I'm going to carry on writing. Now that's bravery. Some would say foolhardy. But it's that kind of attack at one level, I think we're seeing. But we're also seeing attacks on an economic level. I was very interested in, when I was representing Julian Assange, that WikiLeaks were attacked through the financial thing. So they had PayPal removed, and that was done very unofficially, just a call from politicians to the card companies, stop taking payments for these people, and it happened overnight. No accountability, no judicial scrutiny, and so there are all these different levels that I think we're looking at where people are able to approach this. But coming back to your work, Paola, does this mean that there are different? Does it mean that the problem goes away for the government? They're trying to have these arguments and they're trying to battle in this area, but what is the outcome for them? Is it a good prognosis? If you were a doctor?
Well, no, the governments, I would say, are more and more involved in the space of social media, and the Snowden case of last year demonstrates that probably as best as possible, you don't even need anymore to go into the bedroom of someone and install a secret video camera to record things that might be embarrassing. You just take their Twitter feed or something that they wrote on their Facebook wall, and you are done. And all this information is likely to be captured both by governments and by private companies, and we have no idea how this is going to be used.
But in your work, where we were looking at the passive and the active,
yeah.
What's the difference there? I mean, what's provoking this? I mean, are the governments they have a chance to win, or is this pure intimidation?
In my work, the role of the government was left pretty simple, that is an authority that is there to stop the violence, and that's what they want. So I didn't make them more sophisticated than that, and all the sophistication in behavior was on the part of citizens, so it doesn't provide direct insight into that matter. But I think that is a quite relevant question to ask nowadays, as government have become much more skilled at using these tools themselves. And one way could be, you know, using social media to be more present, to be perhaps more helpful. If there's a problem in a street, we are there, but it's not always like that. So
no, I think we're just finding out that tools like Facebook are being used quite the opposite way, that they themselves are using thought experiments on their users and the such like. I mean, the amazing thing really is were not Snowden's revelations, but the fact that you know, we already knew we were being watched. I mean, everybody already knew this all the time. It's just now, post Snowden, it seems that we know that we know. You know, it's suddenly a fact rather than just an inkling. But you know, leaks like Snowden's have been coming out for the last 20 years, and we've always been being monitored in this way. And so I think, if anything, those social media platforms are getting worse in terms of your capacity to actually speak freely.
And so does that mean that the social media platforms are going to become the targets for artists when they come to do their work, as opposed to it perhaps being politics, something like that? Is that where we're moving inexorably with this? I mean,
it's already happening in various ways. There's artists whose entire productions take place via social media in various ways. I wonder how that could then become very disruptive. At the moment, it's the best way it has of doing that is by parodying the kind of content that we see on it anyway. And artists like Amalia Ullman, whose sort of whole practice is about sort of parodying the kind of content that is produced via those lines. How it could be, I mean, maybe that is a kind of soft disruption, but how it could be a kind of more extremely disrupting thing, I'm not sure. You know, yeah.
Maybe a denial of service attack.
Well, you know, yeah, maybe there's sort of you know, something down the line that will be even more intensive than that if you know it can get figured out.
Yeah. Ali, how do you feel about this? Is this moving from a medium of communication for artists who would otherwise be censored to actually the target of the artist?
Well, I think there is a big necessity for regular citizens, artists, everyone, to be able to voice that they're feeling that there's an armed robbery happening or an unarmed robbery happening in the world. In every country we go in, you go to Brazil, you come here, you go to Turkey. There is a strict forceful implications of neoliberal economics, and people are quite unhappy, and they need some place where they can communicate about their unhappiness, and they need a place where they can build strategies of resistance. And at this moment, most of the government, the corporations which own these social medias, are not really interested in promoting that. So there is this tension. They have this tool which can be used for corporate gains, for even more control, and then there are the people who want to use it for other goals of their own. And there is this tension, and I don't know how it will evolve and which side will triumph, if any, but I think the tension will continue, and this need for publicly speaking your unhappiness or your fears, we need this space. If it's not the social media, or if it's not our own public spaces in the cities, the real urban fabric, not the virtual ones, it will become, as Paola is talking about, more violent probably. We need these spaces, we need to be able to talk about our problems, and we need to find ways to resist together. And social media, inadequate as it may be, seems to be one of the only places left to do that. You cannot do it in newspapers, you surely can't do it on mainstream television. So where do you do that? So now there is this conflict over who gets to say what, where, and I think this will continue for artists, for citizens, for everyone.
It's interesting because we've been always looking for artists to innovate, to create ways around censorship. They've always done it. They've always been ingenious, and that's why we love them and love you. And the thing that I think is interesting about this is that we're looking at, you know, artists satirizing and ridiculing, but how is it that they're going to move forward in the future? Do you have a vision of what artists are going to be doing with this new medium or around this new medium to try and communicate dissent in some way?
I think, strangely, artists were being slightly more productive with the internet over the last sort of 20 years. In its emergence, what was called net art was probably more activistic and engaged than what's being termed as post-internet art, which on the whole has become a sort of keyword for a rather surface-like and superficial engagement with technology. And I imagine that will get tiresome, and there'll be a return to the kind of ethoses of net art. However, I'm not sure. I mean, I think social media is a low-functioning commons, like what you're talking about, in that it's a pre-privatized commons. And that's what my point is about the sort of trolling, is that it allows a voice, but all that voice seems to manage to do is complain, because it's not really it's not a balanced enough platform. So, but I think it's something you were talking about earlier in terms of, you were saying the internet was maybe replacing a kind of small press. And I think that's true, you know, the sort of, the old street sellers of proper left-wing newspapers.
The Socialist Worker and your Doc Martens.
Yeah, right, and the class war and things like that have, and you know, things like obscure pamphlets that were called things like, one of the favourites we displayed at the exhibition was called Attack, 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 the Voice of Moderation. Yes. You know, things like that obviously are completely, you know, subsumed by the internet, and there's been lots of vital places to have those kind of conversations, but yeah, it's unsatisfactory.
I'm interested to hear from all of you, and I'm going to come out to the audience in a second, but so get your questions ready. But one of the things that I'm interested in is this link between censorship, which we've already had, always had, you know, from licensing of printing presses right the way through to banning and burning of books. Why is this any different? And are we not just seeing a replication of what we've always seen in this area, and its history repeating itself in new media form?
I just very quickly, I think the voices that were being censored before were often, in terms of book burning or the press, were often already fairly privileged voices. The idea that you can censor, as has happened in Turkey, of voices that were already unprivileged and already had been censored, it's a kind of salt in the wounds, I think.
Yes. Anybody else's? I mean, I was quite interested. You know, go ahead, Paola.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's like taking out some power that the ordinary citizens had got with these new tools, and that wasn't there before, probably. So I entirely agree with your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was very interested in this whole area because, you know, it seemed to me we were put back 100 years when they switched mobiles and the internet off in Egypt, and everybody came out onto their balcony and on rooftops and started singing God is Great to each other. So everybody knew that there was a mass movement there. They just couldn't see it. They could hear it. And I thought that was a really interesting and quite powerful thing. And it was sort of redolent also of the way that Occupy worked. You know, they were not allowed to use loudspeakers, so the person at the middle said something and the people around them conveyed it to the people behind, and so this ring of information, this expanding donut of information went out. And I just thought that was a really interesting way of subverting the censorship, because I was very struck by what you were saying, which is effectively that, you know, whatever you do in terms of censorship, it doesn't well, it actually has the reverse effect, doesn't it?
Yeah, that was our main finding there. If you censor with the goal of even admitting that it is fine, which I think in your case is a priori not, but even admitting that it is fine to do what one can to prevent violence, if it doesn't work, then it's not worth. It's too much sacrifice for, and this announced trade-off between security and liberty is very often a false one, because there's no, I mean, as long as there is no evidence that renouncing one means gaining more of the other, I want to see evidence of that before accepting to give up some of my basic liberties.
So what do you think the key reason for that action? Is it about maintaining traditional top-down sort of control, is to say that is to sort of affirm power? I mean, if the numbers show that it's not the best way to do it, what would convince people that it is?
You mean what would convince people that censorship is fine, or something like that? Well, I don't know, the discourse very generally is that, and that's the same with the massive spying revealed after the Snowden affairs. It's like, okay, you give up some of your liberty, okay, we get all of your information, but that's to protect you from terrorism, violence, whatever. Are we sure? That's my question all the time. That is very rarely asked, and therefore we have no answer. We aren't sure. I mean, in the case of my paper, I can tell you for almost sure that as long as there are grievances toward the government, even in one part of the population, censorship won't eliminate violence. But I think that, you know, it's a wider topic really here that needs to be investigated more.
Do you have an optimal solution then? If there's always going to be violence, can you put it away? I mean, the research that I did, I adverted to at the beginning with GCHQ, where we said, and it came out of Rwanda and the mass murders there and the things that came out of Radio Mille Collines, and we asked GCHQ to monitor conflict zones like Gaza, like Chechnya, and to see whether you could sense by the ratcheting up of the type of language that's used that there's going to be violence. Can you similarly determine that from the other end of the telescope and say there's nothing you can do about this, there's always going to be violence in this situation?
Well, I think what is important is that the right messages should be in place to be heard. So if you want to stop violence, why not encourage, that was the case, for example, in the London riots, why not encourage associations or groups who want to set up a clean-up group in the street? They did use social media quite a lot, in fact, and that was somewhat, you know, after all, still civic engagement, because they weren't leaving that to the government. They were taking responsibility for that. That was a sign of engagement for society. And also, I mean, some of them did protest again, like cuts or other policies they didn't like. But they demonstrated that participation can be more constructive and still express a voice without violence. So giving more space for this type of initiative is probably the way to go, rather than censoring those who say other things.
And when we talk about violence, why are we only talking about this rioting that is the first thing that comes to mind? But 300 people dying in a mine is very violent. Taking away the austerity measures in Greece is very violent. Getting the jobs out of the people, leaving them in precarious job is very violent. And so there will always be some kind of reaction to that. And to think of violence as if it's only done on the streets, and to only think of it in this way as a security threat, I think is leaving the other side of the story quite in the dark. There is always violence, but sometimes it's not in the streets. And if you put it down in measures like censorship or oppression by the police, it will come out at some point in street violence, I think.
It's interesting you say that, because there was a very interesting incident in Korea, the Gwangju incident, where 1,000 people were murdered and by the armed forces in repressing an uprising. The locals took control of Gwangju, and that's now been embraced by artists, interestingly, and so there's big murals there if you go now, and all the rest of it. And I think that there is a way forward, but it's got there needs artists, I think, sometimes to mediate this. Now, I'd like to go out to the audience, so who's going to be brave and stick their hand up first? Yes, your hand is there. Can I see some other hands as well? Another one at the back there, thank you. If you've got one for a specific person, just direct it.
I was just wanted, sort of in general, to ask about your ideas on anonymity in online realms and online communication. And obviously that's something that's been a problem with trolling, people saying that's maybe, that promotes a sort of online, I guess you could say, a violent act, with the anonymity of people being able to just say whatever they want and provoke people and say certain things that they might not say in a physical face-to-face basis. And also in terms of net art as well, and I thought it was interesting what you were saying about far-left groups having a problem with the making of left-wing artwork, and how perhaps it's not seen, or it's seen in a sort of different class maybe. And I think with the idea of net art, how perhaps like the artist's anonymity in that they can have a certain anonymity where we don't know their gender, race or class. You just see the art in the virtual world and existing on this online platform. So perhaps anonymity in that way could be seen as beneficial in the art world for getting those kind of
I think it often makes sense that people distrust artwork and its relationship to politics. Now more than ever, contemporary art has become a luxury object that is mostly valued and controlled by markets. And people seem to almost think it was always that way, and it's not true. It is more that way than ever before. And so art is inherently sort of bourgeois, so it makes sense. But I think that's the art that gets seen, and I think there's a lot of being produced outside of its obvious market relationships. So I understand where that mistrust comes from, but it's not just art so much as a kind of general aesthetic that that people rely upon, and they find a kind of safety in and I think often that can be used against them, and often is. So it's always important as an artist, if you're engaged in activism, is to be sort of challenging the traditional aesthetics and using new ones that hopefully sort of engage people in a different way. But what was your question exactly?
It was about anonymity.
About
anonymity and art and politics, I think. I think you got
Someone
that.
else can take the anonymity one.
Either of you want to weigh in on this?
I'll add very briefly that not on art, because I'm not the expert here, but on anonymity more generally, that we are probably now much less anonymous, even if we try, than we thought we were before. It's probably more a matter for any controllers to check the details, to go back to a name, but it's no longer impossible, or not as impossible as we thought it would be.
I suppose in terms of art, I was sort of thinking about the anonymity of the artist and their kind of context of whether it's like their gender or their race or their class, that maybe being more non-existent, and going on to the way that the artwork scene exists on like as net art, an online platform where you perhaps see it because it's not physically in a space, you don't have the physicality of the artist. An artist could choose to create a fictional character of themselves, which creates the artwork scene in a different context.
Sure.
Yes, but I think that once this artist is starting to get into the regular relationships of the art world, you will most likely know who he or she is and what race. It's quite difficult to remain anonymous in a specific subgroup like that. I don't know what you think. It can be you can do that for a while. You can do it if you really try hard, but I think it's quite difficult. I don't know, maybe
I think some of the most interesting images or sort of ideas that I've seen produced by anonymous people have been on websites like Imgur, you know, which are just sort of random image hosts, but better than most of the artwork I think I've seen in the last few years. And you know, what's interesting about that is it takes again away the privilege of the individual artists getting to sort of produce work based on culture they experience, and actually the internet is an amazing place for aesthetics to be developed, and most of the important sort of mimetic aesthetics that have been developed by a massive anonymous group of people as opposed to individual artists. I think maybe artists are becoming less relevant.
Is there something about perhaps the mic could go to the back, there's a gentleman at the back, could you put your hand up again? There is this sort of anonymity issue around art. I mean, we see it perhaps best personified in Banksy, because nobody's quite worked out that she's an Afro-Caribbean woman yet. And I think that, you know, one of the issues there is that there's this celebritization of art, which goes with the commercialization of art, because you want that kind of, I don't know, Tracy Emin, Damien Hirst kind of personality, cult of personality, even Grayson Perry, around that. Is there something there in terms of anonymity is actually eschewed by the art establishment?
The cult of personality thing is a really tricky one. You know, if you want to know who Banksy is, I mean, you can find out in 5 minutes. It's not hard. He's, you know, middle-class white boy from Bristol. I'm sad to tell you, but
I'm devastated.
But you know, I mean, that his anonymity is about developing a sort of something you can put a price tag on. I mean, it's nothing to do with protecting himself, really. I mean, his graffiti is protected by the government. Basically, all the councils are sticking plastic around his graffiti because they're desperate to sell some of it, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, it has often been a tool for artists, anonymity, but just like for everybody else, it's getting harder and harder to get away with, I think.
Okay. I'm going to take a question back here, and I'm going to go for one more if I see a hand over here as well afterwards, and then we're going to wrap up because it's warm.
I think it's important to pick apart the idea that social media is like one homogenous form of communication. It's sort of split along class and racial biases and its demographic usage, and I think that really affects the way that it's censored. So, for example,
very good point.
Facebook, for example, as well, is also could be seen as like algorithmically censored. It's not just a straight feed of whatever anyone posts, but there's an algorithm at play there. So that's one thing to consider, is when a sufficiently developed algorithm actually becomes censorship, and where that dividing line comes. They have a responsibility to maintain an algorithm. So when does that actually affect it? Twitter, on the other hand, is an open network, and therefore that seems to reverberate a lot more in the media, because it's a lot easier for journalists to search and broadcast, again, those messages. And then something like BBM, which is a closed and encrypted network, which doesn't get any sort of broadcast. So when you're looking at something like the London riots, there was a huge amount of traffic happening, organising amongst people who were protesting / rioting, whatever you want to call it. But none of that is ever read or put out in the media, because it was all encrypted in a closed network. So those voices aren't heard, whereas something like riot cleanup is heard, is broadcast, and then is in itself filtered by the media. So that what you saw from riot cleanup was lots of nice people going out and sweeping up, and the converse side of that, which was its racial bias and stuff, isn't seen. So the fact in Eltham, for example, you had vigilante attacks on innocent black and ethnic minority teenagers simply for being black and ethnic minority, under that sort of rubric of this so-called positive riot cleanup. I was wondering whether there were similar sort of splits in the way people use social media in Turkey, and also how those differences were taken into account in your computer modelling.
Great question.
Yes, absolutely great question. I agree that I mean, censorship is possible in social media, but it's more complicated. And as you said, one would have to take into account the specificity of each medium and how it works and the algorithm that sustains that. If you do a simple Google search, well, there's a long list of words that are blacklisted by Google for one reason or another, and the list is updated, as far as I know, regularly. So, you know, that is something that is in place, and some of the words might even make us laugh at some point. I don't remember the examples precisely, but there may be particular reasons why they are there. So this is something that is in place, is evolving. It's not always transparent, but it's complex. I agree with you to put in place. Now, in the particular model I worked on, I didn't look at all these different details because I was particularly interested in the main outcomes, while I entirely agree that this would be worth another research to look at the specificities and the details. So, for example, from one thing that I didn't mention is that research was done during the riot, so in a very short time, but afterward, when the data were made available, other colleagues here in the UK have examined the Twitter corpus of messages tweeted during the period of the riots, and for example, it appeared that the highest users were journalists and the cleanup organizations. So there were very few people who used it to organize any rioting at all. That, as you said, turned out to be based primarily on the BBM. So, you know, this is information that came out, in fact, progressively, and that, yeah.
Okay. What do you think about this algorithmic censorship? And,
Sorry?
Will you react to the question?
Well, it's a bit different in Turkey because most of the internet users who are very legible, shall we say, in the social media are coming from the more, let's say, not privileged, I will not go that far, but more educated classes usually. So there is already an entrance ban. So when the internet is oppressed or is tried to be blocked, you are blocking a kind of a certain group of people. It's not a minority by any means. I think there's about 25 million Facebook accounts or something in Turkey, which is quite a big one. But I think there is that. It links to the different social classes, and all of that is within the. And that's why it was. Well, it's maybe too specific to the country, but there is, of course, that. And in Turkey, I'm sure it's a bit different from here.
Okay, well look, I did promise you a question, but I'm afraid we are absolutely out of time, but do come up to the panel afterwards and ask the question, because I'm sure this debate's going to carry on afterwards and in the bar and elsewhere. I'd like you to thank Dr. Paola Tubaro, Charlie Woolley and Ali Kazma for quite a wonderful and intellectually stimulating discussion tonight. Thank you.